Então, é um prazer abrir o nosso segundo painel da Conferência Democracia no Brasil. A pessoa que vai liderar esse painel é a Leila Lehnen, que é uma das organizadoras dessa conferência. Leila recentemente chegou na Brown, da Universidade do Novo México, e ela é a diretora do Departamento de Estudos Portugueses e Brasileiros, e somos muito felizes que ela está aqui. Ela é especializada em literatura contemporânea brasileira, e as suas áreas temáticas incluem a representação de cidadania, direitos humanos, a justiça social e na literatura e produção cultural. E como outros painéis, ela vai introduzir os panelistas, os convidados, que falarão por 15 a 20 minutos, e depois teremos uma hora de discussão. Muito obrigada, bem-vindos. Muito obrigado, Jim.
Event, which has been very inspiring. Thank you for the organizing committee, and I would like to especially thank Ramon and Marina. So I'm actually going to introduce our speakers in Portuguese, and I'm going to start in the order that they appear in the program, but we inverted the order of the panel. So we're going to start, Sidney Chalhoub is going to speak first, and then the panel is, you like that, huh? And then MC Carol is going to speak last. Então, MC Carol é cantora, compositora,
singer and songwriter and culture activist in Brazil. Her songs are both musical and with a very strong political content. They approach from history of Brazil, like Não Foi Cabral, and the feminism and women in the periphery, and more recently, the death of Marielle Franco. In 2018, MC Carol, also inspired by Marielle, was a pre-candidate to the Legislative Assembly of the Rio State. MC Carol launched the album Bandida in 2016 with many singles, amongst them 100% Feminista. Éder Oliveira is from, and I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sorry, Timbuktuá. I'm Gaúcha, I'm sorry. In the north region of the country, he has a bachelor's in visual arts, and since 2004 has been developing works in identity. His main theme is the Amazonian man. In 2014, he participated in the São Paulo Bienal. And finally, Sidney Chalhoub is a historian, and since 2015, a professor in the history department in African and American Studies at Harvard. He's associated to the Department of Romance Language and Literature at Harvard. From 1998 to 2015, he was a professor at Unicamp. He researches themes like race, slavery, public health, and Machado de Assis. In 1997, he received a Jabuti for the book Fever City. Welcome and thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very good to be able to speak in Portuguese. I had prepared everything in English, but when I arrived, I realized that everyone was speaking in their native language, and so I'm going to take this opportunity to do this as well. The opportunity to speak my own language these days are not that common. This table begins with kind of an anticlimactic moment, because whatever comes after me will be certainly more important and more interesting than academic freedom and that discussion. And I know that you're going to see things that are really interesting. Even if I had a really interesting topic, you would see things that are more interesting later on in this session. So it's interesting having to talk about academic freedom after having I've taught in Brazil for more than 30 years. 36 years I've been a university professor, and only the last 4 have been here in the U.S. But all you need to do is open the newspaper to be able to see that it's important to talk about academic freedom. And even yesterday, there was the astrologer and guru said that, quote, the people who destroyed Brazil were the philosophy professors, the lawyers or professors of law, and of political science, or social sciences, rather. These people have to be unmasked completely. And we don't have we can't pay attention to their numerical superiority. We have to unmask them. So I was upset because they didn't include historians. I've done my part to disrupt the system, but they didn't include me in that group. And of course, you know, beyond this episode, that's can only be treated with disdain. A week ago, there was the sad report of authors of history textbooks that are already adopting a form of self-censorship. They're changing the way they talk about the military dictatorship, calling it something else. I don't know what else they could call it, but they are. And so anyway, it's a sad report. And then other things. Last year there was the episode of the attempt to censor a course that was offered at a university, and the theme of that course was the coup and the military dictatorship, and the reaction to that was promising, I think, and gives us hope in terms of fighting the current government, because the course was offered in other public universities throughout the country, and so that was a really important reaction and response to the attempt to censor those kinds of teaching and messages. What I'm going to talk about today, it was all in English originally, but the essential texts of academic freedom in the national network, the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, and they are preparing these texts for their website. And so the ideas, the things that I'm going to talk about are, the things that that have struck me from those core texts that are going to be published on the site. And one difference that we make or highlight is the difference between freedom of expression and academic freedom. So academic freedom it requires or is based on on freedom of speech, but they're two different things. So how do we deal with, or I should say, why are they different? So understanding this difference is important for us to know how to deal with the apparent belief of the extreme right, that because people who believe that the Earth is flat, that global warming is a hoax, is a conspiracy theory, that creationism is an alternative view to evolutionism, and these kinds of things, that the dictatorships that existed in Latin America during the Cold War period were not actually dictatorship. How do we deal with that? With those beliefs of those of the far right, that these people that they should have a kind of protected platform in universities to transmit their messages. So the situation in the U.S. and in Brazil isn't actually that different. In March of this year, The Guardian published an article talking about President Trump signing an executive order that said universities in North America that do not guarantee freedom of speech will have their public funding cut, their government funding cut. And I don't know, I'm sure that what he understands freedom of speech to mean is that people on the far right can speak in universities just like Brown and Harvard and things like that. So in this sense, I think there are a lot of kind of overlaps and points in common between the U.S. and Brazil, and that's one of those. So what is academic freedom in practice? Why is it different from freedom of speech? And I'm talking from my own experience as a university professor during the last, 35 years. So in research universities, big research universities in Brazil, in the US, wherever, knowledge is the common goal, right? Constructing knowledge. Professors, researchers, students, that they produce knowledge about whatever topic without being silenced or affected by the powers that be, that they have this academic freedom to research what they want. And the university is part of society, but it's organized in such a way that it guarantees that this interference doesn't happen and doesn't control or restrict the knowledge that's produced in university spaces. The academic freedom, therefore, is an ideal. It's an objective that we are always trying to work toward. And these institutions, these universities, they have procedures to guarantee the defense of academic freedom. In the case of Brazil, what we've seen in the last few decades is the construction of a system of higher education and that has always counted on a significant amount of academic freedom, autonomy in terms of what they teach, and in terms of their administration, that produced and continues to produce really significant results in studies. And so I can speak from my own experience because I began as a student in the 70s in Rio in the Federal University, and I studied there when the military dictatorship still had its hands in the university and in its administration. I know what that is like. We had class with, there were police officers in front. The back door was locked. Whatever paper you signed in the university could be sent to the police. There was no environment of academic freedom in that time. And then I came to the U.S. and after amnesty was granted, and when people were exiled, the quality of instruction really went down because those who were the leading figures in the field were gone, and so only the mediocre professors were left. So anyway, when I came back to Brazil, we worked to create a system of masters and doctoral programs and things, and that is, I'm not a patriot, I'm not trying to brag, but it is one of the best in the world. And we produce really great scholars and research. And I think this is a really important gain that we had, and and I'd like to preserve that kind of academic freedom and facilitate that kind of academic production. So it's really important in this moment to notice and to take notice of what's going on. We complain about the amount of reports and meetings and procedures, the bureaucratic procedures that we see in the academic world for tenure, for promotions, for evaluating students. And in a time like this, we have to look at what exists, what is institutionalized, and see them as a shield, to defend academic freedom. And so these procedures, and for example, public competition, taking tests to be able to go into college, evaluating, parent evaluations, needing certification for everything that you do and approval. And we've had some improvements even recently, having the university more open to Brazilian society, talking about affirmative action, allowing people from different backgrounds to enter the university. And for a long time, I heard about, I would hear people complain that university was kind of out of touch with society. And I think now the university understands what it needs to do. It doesn't have to go to society. The society has to be inside the university. And it's inside the university through these policies of affirmative action. And in my opinion, the ideal would be, accepting everyone who is interested and who's qualified to the university. That would be the ideal, right? It would be for all those who want to study and who have the the capacity to do that. And until we get that ideal, until we realize that ideal, the policies of affirmative action should guarantee at least, in terms of representation, that society be in the university in terms of the various groups that make up society. The instruction in universities needs to improve. The faculty, they need to be evaluated. They need to improve. And people have been complaining about them a long time. And people have been advocating for including people of African descent in the university in terms of faculty and students. And we fought for the beginning of affirmative action in graduate programs. And so we started to establish quotas at Unicamp even before the federal mandate to do so. And historians and social sciences, those that are destroying Brazil, we are destroying Brazil. We work to guarantee that. And one of the things that we did in that time was to ask the university to make a report and see out of all of the faculty at Unicamp how many professors identified as having African descent. And out of 2,030, only 30 identified as having African heritage. And that was this is a challenge that the Brazilian universities have not really faced fully, and they haven't worked through these issues yet. So this idea of having entrance exams for a university, it protects the university, but it also creates other problems about access and things like that. So the first shock that I had in Harvard was a meeting, the welcome meeting for the professors. There was 30 or 40 of us, and I saw the list of professors, and I remembered my colleagues from the 70s who were in the U.S., John Smith, Mary Williams, all these names. It was a half dozen names, and kind of the same names, the same common names, and I wasn't. And when I looked this time when I went into Harvard, I was unable to see. I saw the list of names, and I thought I can't pronounce half of these names, and so that seemed to me to reflect a variety of origins and backgrounds, and to me seems like progress in creating a diverse faculty. That's a challenge that Brazilian universities have to face at some point. So, but these processes, these procedures, are the reason why no politician, judge, general, military official can dictate what historians will research and write and teach. They cannot do this because they don't have academic freedom to do that. They're not intellectual figures. They can and should exercise, as we all should, the right to yell what they want on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and wherever there are people that will hear them. But to dictate how we should teach about the military dictatorship, if it was a dictatorship or not, that is not their prerogative. It's a prerogative of people like James Green. And academic freedom is a process of making arguments and proving them based on data, and continuing to research and make arguments in that way, in a way that's intellectually sound. Interpretations that are based on empirical research and theory, and are in touch with kind of the intellectual movements of the day. So academic freedom is the concept that guarantees, for example, that as an astrologer from wherever he may be or she may be on the internet, it could never be seen, based on their credentials, a professor of philosophy in Rio University, for example. And these credentials are in place so that we can protect and preserve academic freedom, which also contributes to freedom of expression. Of course, having said this, there's a bunch of problems that we still have to deal with. It's not a peaceful relationship in the university sphere between freedom of speech, which should be defended, and also academic freedom. For example, and this is a very serious problem in the context of the North American university, in which freedom of speech has become the defense of freedom of speech has reached a level that in other societies they haven't reached that yet. So in the name of freedom of speech, they should universities should defend the right of anyone who's there to speak their mind. So what does freedom of speech mean when it's taken to this extreme? This idea of using universities as a platform to spread, discourses of hate and extreme fundamental right conservative ideas. Should we allow these kinds of things to happen? When the governor of Rio talks about exterminating people, when he talks about Harvard, do we have the right, or do we have the right to stay silent? We don't have the right to stay silent when things like this happen. What are the consequences of not saying anything? So the idea that freedom of speech should be so when you read a bunch of books that are, there was a great book that came out recently by a historian, a feminist historian, about the freedom of speech. And in general, the discussion is about how, freedom of speech should be tolerated on campus. It should be kind of managed by universities. When the presence of the person speaking represents a threat to those in the community. But I ask our North American colleagues, and for us, and to us as well. Now that I'm here, I'm part of this, this group of North American professors. When empowering those who will present and speak at universities, when their arrival, when they're visiting campus, contributes to an empowerment of the vulnerability and the vulnerability of minorities and other groups, is that kind of freedom of speech acceptable? Can we do this? Can we invite them and allow them to speak in universities in the name of freedom of speech, or should we impose on them the criteria of academic freedom? Thank you.
Our next guest is Éder Oliveira.
Can you hear me? I am soft-spoken. I'd like to start thanking you for the invitation and for the opportunity. I'd like to thank James Green and to all those who are organizing the event and who are making this possible. And I'm going to talk about something that's very personal today. I'd like to thank, as a Brazilian, the opportunity to be participating in something like this and to think and rethink about Brazil and where we might end up. And I think this is really important. And I noticed this yesterday during the talk of the three panelists who were there. I was thinking about how serious what everything's happening is. And it's easy to say that our culture, its suffering is a part of our culture, but in light of the talks yesterday, I think it's important that we remember that we need to act. So I wasn't really sure what to talk about. I wasn't sure I'd be able to talk about my work or about the theme that I was assigned, which is, I found it a lot easier to talk about my own work. And so I'm going to try and use my research as an illustration for this topic, which is the cultural resistance. And I didn't want to be, I don't want to talk about being in a meritocracy, and I don't want to be a token representative here. My name is Éder Oliveira. I come from Chiboutewa, which is a region of the state of Pará in the north of Brazil. And I lived there until I was 17 when I went to Belém, which is a larger city in Pará, to study. And I started to study art and in the Federal University of Pará. And in my second or third year there of college, I have my first contact with painting. And that encounter showed me something that would come to be a really big part of my work later, which is it became kind of a tonic, an outlet for me. Oh, okay. I'm also colorblind, and so it's been a really big challenge for me. So that maybe that works against me a little bit as a painter. But at the same time, I had the desire to represent kind of common individuals, and I used to do graffiti. I wouldn't paint, but I would draw people and illustrate things on magazines, famous people, and try and represent people that I saw in pictures. And one of my first experiences with painting was trying to paint a kind of a common person, somebody who had a kind of similar life story to mine. So, and so I wanted to show an individual who had a story that was similar to mine, not exactly like mine necessarily, but people that are from the periphery, people that are in the margins, that had real stories and that weren't in magazines. They weren't appearing on the news and on commercials and things like that. People that I didn't see in those spaces I wanted to represent. And I realized that was kind of an attempt to get a self-portrait. And so I started to look for people, those kinds of people, and where they were portrayed. So I didn't find them in magazines, so I looked in newspapers, and I started getting involved with kind of the police beat of the newspapers. And there's an extra section in the newspaper that is the police beat. And this newspaper has a lot of pictures, there's color, and it's very common to put pictures of somebody there, illustrating, a crime that they committed. This person was was arrested. They had the date that happened, their age, and it's a very sensationalist way of representing them. And so my thought was I wanted to take those kind of pictures and give to this marginalized person, the right to a pictorial representation, which is a certain status symbol. And but I found that wasn't enough. And so I started to play with the scale, and because of the color blindness, maybe to change the color. And that I found that wasn't enough either. So I went to the city, and this giant face that was put in kind of like a negative as art in the city, and so these kinds of images, they were the result of that desire. And they're talking about urban art in the city and contemporary art, and here are a couple of examples. So the theme of my talk today would be the individual from the Amazon, and the tendency is to talk about the Amazonian man, but I would like to talk about the collective Amazonian group. And I have trouble talking about women because of the identity questions, because when women are represented, they're a lot easier to recognize. But I wanted to focus on common people who are fragile, and so I think men are a little bit harder to recognize in terms of their fragility and their background when you see a picture of them. So it's rare to see a picture of a woman and not immediately be able to figure out her background. And I don't want to do a kind of a portrait of anyone, but use an image to represent a group of people who don't have a voice and who don't have the power to kind of choose various things in their lives. And so, my street art, lots of them, most of them have to do with this kind of big scale and these colors. So, in this moment of my work, this one, for example, is from 2013, 14, 15, 16. In that period of time, we were in a kind of a tense moment in our country, and the tragedy that people have been talking about, the fall of democracy and things. And myself and other artists, we've been working to try and engage these problems, and I don't think I represent the whole group of artists here, but I just wanted to speak from my experience. This is from the São Paulo Biennial, 2014, this art festival, and it was very emblematic of my work because it was the first time in there was a recent political scene that art became an instrument of politics, of kind of opposition politics and protest against the far right. This was a very political biennial event, and it was questioning, religious beliefs and social questions, environmental questions, and there were a lot of protests. The evangelicals were protesting the biennial, and at the time it was very absurd. We thought this is not going to result in anything, but then it became more and more intense. The attacks became more intense. The attacks against artists, and there was a man who was performing, and they've been kind of twisting performances to accuse people of being pedophiles, and there have been videos launched of that have kind of twisted artistic representation and led to attacks against us as artists. And among other things, in Goiânia there was an exhibition that was closed down. Museums have been closed in Belo Horizonte, in Campo Grande. You know, expositions are being attacked. There's a lot of things that have transformed artists who before were defenders of the minority. They've now become villains to this new regime and this new administration. And, you know, we didn't give up the fight, and we've now become defenders of democracy, the cause of democracy, and those kinds of values. And so artists are very active on social media, and now, you know, the perception is that artists are from the left. So in other moments of my work, I could talk about you know, my impression of how this marginalized individual is when he's represented in painting is no longer marginalized, and you know, it's interesting because you take this image from a newspaper, from the police beat, from the crime section, and then he goes to an art museum, you know, this picture of him, and then goes to cultural spaces of discussion and production, and you know, so it's a process of giving a voice to that person through art, but at the same time he's still visible. Other examples of my work. Screen, you know, is an example of canvases in which I've painted, and the theme of marginality has become more and more important in my work, and I've explored it in different ways, and studying these bodies that hide themselves, and how can I help these faces, these bodies, these identities hide, you know, that shouldn't be published because they weren't judged, they didn't get a fair trial, they were just suspects. So according to law, they weren't supposed to appear in the newspapers, but here they are. So there's all these discussions of appropriation, and I appropriate things to talk about art and to talk about images, and I always try and make it clear that I'm representing not a person, but I'm trying to paint a portrait of something that was published in a newspaper. I don't know these people, I've never seen them, and probably never will see them, but I create their portraits to try and represent this group of people. Last year I had the opportunity to visit a penitentiary in Belém, and to speak with some people about you know, their experience, and see what they think of my work, and what they would think if they saw their own face in a piece of art like this. And it was really interesting because as much as we try and have an open mind, we have a lot of prejudice and bias. And first thing, I started giving my talk, and you know, people were raising questions and challenging my representations, and this is really good because they have they're very conscious of what's going on, and people were very supportive, and they said, you do great work, and you know, you represent us, and it was really interesting. I had a lot more to say, but I'm a little nervous, and so I think I skipped some things, so let's just go to the questions.
Now, MC Carol will speak. And is it true that you're going to sing too? And are you going to sing before the questions? Yeah. Anyways, I'm a little bit nervous too, no one believes, but I'm timid, very shy. So we can start. My name is Carolina de Oliveira Lourenço. I was born in Prevetório, in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. I'm 25 years old. My dream when I was a child was to be to draw. And I was raised by my great-grandparents, and my great-granddad told me that that had no future financially, and so I went to search about other professions. And I came back to him and I said, Grandp, I'm gonna be a cop. And so I was raised like a man. I was raised free to choose my toys and friendships. My grandpa was really happy with that. And I was raised to be a woman cop, a policewoman. So when I was 14, they passed away. I was evicted. I had to drop out of school. I had to start making it for my own. And in the middle of this madness, when I was 14, there was a guy in my community. He was about 30, and he would make some CDs. And I was passing by, and I heard a song, a funk beat, and he asked me, well, do you want to sing? And I was like, I don't know how to sing. So, but I was already very creative, because I did drawings for T-shirts, and I would make some funny shirts, and I was this cool clown. So the guy said, like, let's do it. And I was like, oh, I thought of something. So there was a guy in my community who was a moto taxi. He did taxi with motorcycles to go up the hill. And I was always in the middle of them. And once there was one of them who was really drunk, walking on the street. And he would sing, and when he saw me, he would sing, I'm gonna get you pregnant. And so people would laugh at me. And so I had to masculinize myself. I had to dress like a man and think like a man to get men's respect. And I thought, oh my God, this guy is really shaming me. And so so he was talking about getting me pregnant and dropping me and breaking up with me. So I started thinking about, like, I'm gonna get revenge on this guy. So there was a police station, and he said, I'm gonna take you to the police station and destroy your life if you get me pregnant and leave me. And so I started, and this rhymes in Portuguese, so that became a song, and everyone was impressed. And then they were saying, oh my God, yes, she's truly a bandit. So let me explain the bandit nickname. I was raised to be a cop. I was born a feminist. I was a child with a very strong personality. And instead of nicknaming Carol Cop, they nicknamed me Carol Bandit when I was 5. When I was 4, I shaved my head because they wouldn't let me tie my hair, because girls wouldn't tie their hairs. So I shaved my head. So this nickname has followed me throughout my life today, which is Bandit. So I did that song for that guy. And it started to spread through the community, and there was like the studio, which later on the police came in and absolutely destroyed it. We didn't have a studio anymore. Thankfully, internet was already strong, so we started doing it without the studio, but things started going from there. At that time, we didn't have phones, internet. We had to go to LAN houses, which are places where you go and hire internet by the hour. So people in my community started asking me to record in their phones that song. That was the only song I had. And that started spreading till my grandma heard it. I lived alone, but my great-grandma would sometimes call me over and see like what I'm saying and say like, "What are you doing? Are you playing by the rules? You're not gonna get arrested." And then she heard I was singing funk. Before that, sorry, it got out in the community, and another community asked me to sing. There was no funk parties in my community, but the community next to it that had asked me to go and sing, and I was like, I'm not gonna go. I drank some wine, got convinced. Just speaking the truth here. Didn't drink. And I was 15, drank a lot of wine, got on stage, danced, and people wanted me every week. Every week. People would go to my house to pick me up. So I'd go. And I would sing. In 3 months, I was invited to tape the DVD for Furacão. Furacão is a Brazilian funk band. And from there, things just started going, and now I'm here. So when my grandma found out, it's almost if they told her I gone into drug trafficking. My grandma was like, "Forget I'm your grandma," and I was, well, Grandma, I love funk, I love singing. I'd been surviving by gigs, by informal work, side jobs, and I was not making a lot of money. I would make a few bucks every show as well, and so I had to step back from my grandma for a while. So around 2015 is when she started accepting this as my job. But I always say that funk saved my life. It saved my life. It truly saved my life. I'm not saying it saved my life because my life has gotten better. When I was 14, I lived in a very precarious house. It was just a bathroom and a small room. Water would come in. It was very, very precarious. And when you're a woman, it's even worse because we have certain necessities every month, and I didn't have money to buy things that I needed. Funk saved my life because I already didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to start sending my CV out when I was 14, but I didn't have pants to go out and look out for a job, right? When I would take my CV to places, they didn't even take it because they looked at me and they didn't want me to work there. So I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know how I was going to keep surviving. And funk, it does that. It doesn't matter what I sing. If it's very crass lyrics, it doesn't matter. It saved my life. It helps me. And it helps people around me. So when you see the news, like Renata Penha, who is wanted and is going to be arrested, is very sad. Because who isn't from inside the community understands him as a criminal. But who's inside knows he's not a criminal. In my community, they murdered my aunt, my mother's sister. She was pregnant. She was 7 months pregnant, and killed her. Drug trafficking. My cousin also was killed when he was 19. I have to go through those guys who killed my family, and I have to say good morning and good night. Thanks to funk, it has been a while that I've been able to leave this community. But the mothers of these people in my family who were killed, they're still there, and they have to go through these people and say good morning and good night and pretend nothing happened. So, Renan da Penha is going to be arrested because he would say hi to criminals. When I go visit my family, I have to say hi to these people who killed my family. My 7-month pregnant aunt. So it's very, very sad for a funk singer to be persecuted because of that. So there's another question that he let people know through the phone. He called about a raid. Well, we have family there. You know, when police goes up there, they don't care if it's a school time, if kids are on the street. So we call and we let them know. We let them know, don't go on the street because police is going up. So to marginalize a funk singer like that is really sad because this persecution of funk is very, very old. My community's funk studio was completely destroyed. It was basically a computer, a table, a desk, and a microphone. And it helped me, and it helped a lot of people. This guy that ran the studio, he helped a lot of people. And police came in, and there was a raid. They heard a little bit of funk, and they came in and saw a microphone, and they broke everything. They don't even ask first. So that funk is being persecuted is not a new thing. Funk singers have always been seen as marginal. I'm used to saying that I have a lot of respect to funk singers because I can't imagine when I came in, there was already a more welcoming environment. Tachi, who's another funk singer, was already inside, was already more popular. But before that, I can't even imagine. Right? And now, with the current government, we're going back to those darker days. We're going back to marginalizing more. There's a guy who worked with me that his dad asked me, why doesn't Carol go into politics? She's already so politicized. And so I thought, well, let me go in. And Anna, who works with me, she knew Marielle and Taliria, and they invited her for a meeting. And I met with them, and I was like, that's who I want to be. That's who I want to be. I felt very empowered. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. That's what I thought. They gave me a power that I never had. Marielle used to say that you have to stuck your foot in the door. So, and they said, like, black women have to stuck their foot in the door. And so that's what I said. I said, that's where it's all about. I have to do it. And I thought that's what I want for myself. I'm going to do it. So a few months later, this conversation was in December, and in March, Marielle was assassinated. So I spent the whole night crying as if a family member had been murdered. And I think that day Brazil cried. And I don't want to know about this anymore, I thought. I was afraid. I'm gonna erase all of my political songs. I'm gonna stop talking about these things. So I started to see a lot of comments about how we can't silence ourselves. Her death can't be in vain. So I thought I'm gonna make a song. So I was writing and crying and writing Marielle Franco, the song. On April 4th, I suffered an attempt of feminicide by my ex-husband, and so that changed again, and I want to go back. I thought I want to go back to politics because I survived this, and I gotta help other women. So later on in April, I was stopped at a blitz, a traffic. It's a traffic. Police officers were looking into cars, and so they stopped me and they singled me out, and they pointed 20 automatic rifles at me, and they started frantically asked me to come out and put my hands up, and I was trying to ask if I could put my hand down, and I really thought I was gonna die. And when I opened the door, I told them, "This is not a stolen car. I am not a criminal. The documents for the car are inside the car." And they started cussing me out and saying, "Lay down on the floor in the middle of the street in Niterói," with constantly cussing me. They wanted to kick us on the floor. It was me and my brother on the ground, and me and my brother and three friends, and everything was the car is ours. Everything was right, and they wouldn't stop screaming as if it seemed like it was a drug trafficker. And after they cussed us out, after they humiliated us, they let us go. And I was like, I gotta report this as police station. I gotta tell them I didn't do anything. And then when I realized, when they let us go, one of them sang one of my songs. And that's when I understood what was happening. And then when I was going to the police station, they started following us. So I made a turn to a street, a residential street, and stopped in the front of cameras in a very bright place where we knew there was cameras. And they kept passing by, laughing at us, and I stayed an hour there after they gone, afraid. And that's the Rio police. That's the Rio de Janeiro police. You're afraid of the police. It's wild to think about that when we speak about the police in social media, people judge us as, well, you're a criminal. You are defending criminals. When you talk about police abuses, people judge you as a criminal. And I say, I'm not a criminal. I'm not defending criminals. I actually had 3 people of my family killed by criminals. But the path is not to kill criminals. The path is to re-socialize. It's to give people a starting point. Because I have many examples that I could give, but I'll talk about a boy, 2 boys. One, he was 11 when I met him. He's probably 13 now. He lost his mom, and when he was 11, he would go to traffic signs in order to beg for money and be able to sustain his younger brother and his grandfather who's in a wheelchair. I know a boy who's 11 who spends his whole nights collecting cans in order to recycle them and make sense on them. It's really hard to talk to these children. It's really hard for them to open themselves up. Before I ask anything, I tell them about my life. And that's when they think, well, she's been through this. I can tell her. So that's when they tell me. So in my community, when I was a kid, there was a lot of sports. I played a lot of sports. Nowadays, there's nothing. There's nothing. These children spend their whole days in the street doing nothing, sometimes playing pool at bars. So I think that government should actually help these communities. There's a lot of talented children. At Vidigal, which is another peripheral community, there's a theater initiative, where a lot of famous actors come in and artists come in. But it's just because there was this one guy who decided to do it. But what about the other communities? We are abandoned. We've been abandoned by the state, and the government thinks that the solution is to go in and kill us. And the solution is not to kill. I'm gonna arrest someone. I'm gonna throw them in an overcrowded cell. But one day he's gotta go back to the street, and then what? I have a lot of childhood friends that were arrested for stealing cell phones. Got out and got back in for homicide. There's a boy in my community, he's 17. He went to rob. The woman gave him the purse and he stabbed her. And that makes you think, what takes someone, a child, to stab a person for a cell phone? What takes somebody to do this? To be so cold. For a person to be so cold. Their life has been cold. Sometimes the child that spend their whole life seeing their mom being beat up by their dad, who's never had love either from their mom or their dad, you know? We've been talking about this today, about the cycles of violence within the family, about the woman, the mother who beats their child, and who herself is beaten. So it's very complicated. Do you want to say something, Anna? Hi, everyone. I have a very loud voice. Good afternoon. My name is Ana Paula Paulino. I'm Carol's manager. We've become sisters, friends, sometimes witches, godmothers, fairy godmothers. We have multiple functions. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm very emotional. I'm gonna try to hold myself back, seeing Carol here today. Unlike Carol, I'm a black woman who wasn't born in Rio. I was born in Belo Horizonte. And my parents were professors, and they've always told me and my sister that the way for us to get ahead in life would be to study. That education will give us everything that we want. I studied in private schools because my parents were teachers in public schools, and they knew that the quality of public schools were declining. So my friends had a different reality. They'd go to Disney World and have all these design things. And my parents saying, we don't have money to give you that because we're giving you an education. But when you grow up, after you study, you'll have all of that. So I studied in a Catholic school. I studied English. I did exchange programs. I studied Spanish. I graduated in social communications at a federal university. I thought about going into law school. I thought about being going to foreign service. I ended up going into social communications because I saw that those other things is not what I wanted to see. I've always been very, very close to cultural movements because I started dancing when I was 3, and kind of like Carol's grandfather, I believed that art wouldn't give us money and couldn't afford us financially. And I wanted to have this other life where I could have some financial stability. So I'm going to go to law school and to go into public service. But I ended up going into social communications and for myself in public relations. So I was an intern in Minas. And then they hired me, and I realized that's not what I wanted. I couldn't understand why I didn't want to stay there. And then I moved to Rio. I wanted to work with cultural production. I already worked at the World Cup. So I wanted to go to Rio. I'd been there before, and Olympics were coming. So I already had the contacts to go there. And so in 2014, I went to Rio. And in 2015, I met personally Carol. And my life changed that day. When I went to Rio, I started working with cultural movements and funk. One of the project was Heavy Baile. The creator of that project was the one who introduced me to Carol. So I went to Rio and started dealing with people from the periphery. I understood that I lived in a bubble. And I think that my talk would be perfectly summarized in that when we're here, we're talking about things, and we need to be here talking about here, and the academics are necessary. I managed to succeed in life because I went and studied, and my parents were right. And that's true. But that's not the only truth. And beyond it not being the only truth, somebody said this yesterday. We're all privileged for being here today in this moment. The majority of Brazilian population can't have this access. And if by chance Carol and I hadn't been met, we wouldn't have left our bubbles. Because Carol was a girl that was raised by her grandfather. And I was talking with her today about this. She had difficulties, but her grandfather really gave her notions of morals and values, that she had to always say the truth and really work for herself. That when she got kicked out when she was 14, she already had a sense of what she would and would not do. And as she was saying, the children today don't have that type of sense. So at the same time that she was raised by her grandfather who would say these things, the message that we're sending to the youth at the periphery is that they can't everything, that they're not intelligent enough, that they can't handle it, that university is not for them. And Carol said that my grandfather said that I could be a judge, but he didn't say how expensive it is. And I said, well, they're public colleges. And she said, yeah, but you got to go into private school to get into the public colleges. And that's my story, because my parents could afford to send me to private school. So this encounter between me and Carol, I say it's definitive. It's changing for both of our lives, because I understand myself as a black woman. I have always understood myself as a black woman. By the color of my skin, I can't pass. But I've always lived in a limbo where I've never been either black enough or white enough. Because since I always traveled through white environments, when I got into the periphery, they wouldn't recognize me. So Carol, who is very skittish of everyone she meets at first, we started creating this affection connection. I was talking to a few people that I met yesterday here, that when I met Carol when she was 21, she wasn't registered to vote. And in Brazil, it is mandatory to register to vote when you're 18. And in my mind, it was impossible to live without being registered to vote, because that kind of blocks you in the bureaucracy system. And she said to me, why would I be registered? What I'm going to vote for? And that scared me. How do you not understand why you vote? And I realized we need to talk to other people. The change we're building here today doesn't matter if everyone here knows we're changing things. We need to think outside this room. We need to take this outside this room. We're living in very dark times in Brazil, very heavy times, very tense times. So I realized that for people like Carol, they have always been like this. They have always been this violent. So the past days have been very hard because I lost somebody who was my friend, who represented me, who was Marielle. And we are in a state where we're afraid. I'm afraid for Carol. The first thing, my first reaction when Marielle was assassinated was to call Carol and tell her, please don't say anything right now. We need to be silent for right now and see what's happening. Because we don't have security, we're afraid, and people are talking about how they have to leave Brazil in order to survive, in order to live. And there's a lot of people who don't have that choice, but the people who live in the peripheries, they're living like that all the time. And so I think we're articulating in that sense, and I'm very happy to see people articulating, but we forget to talk with the people who need it the most, who are the people. Or the people in the periphery and don't know that voting for a different governor is going to influence the way the way the police act inside their communities. They do not understand it because they can only think in the immediate level, and the immediate level for them is drug trafficking. So they don't know that there's beyond that. So I needed to find Carol to take me out of my bubble, and she needed to find me so I can take her out of the bubble, for her to understand that even if she didn't have a bachelor in law or having a PhD, she has a graduate degree from the School of Life, and her PhD is in experience, and that's crucial to understand, sometimes even more important, because I can understand my fight today as a Black woman through Carol, which are two lives that are very similar in some ways, but that are also very, very apart in others. And I keep thinking about how my life today would be if I didn't have my parents, if my parents were not teachers, if they hadn't been able to go through college. And sometimes I think I could be Carol. But actually, Carol was lucky. I could have been another girl in the periphery who's not here today, who can't speak what I'm saying. And that's the warning I wanted to give you all. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you for showing her that she belongs in this space, that this is also her space. Yeah, that's it, everyone. Let's stop crying. Let's sing. But are you going to sing now? Let's do question first. Oh, sorry. Let's do question first. Now they want you to sing. No, people, let's finish it up with the singing. So let's go.
Presenciei tudo isso dentro da minha família. Mulher com o olho roxo, espancada todo dia. Eu tinha uns 5 anos, mas já entendia que mulher apanha se não fizer comida. Mulher oprimida, sem voz obediente. Quando eu crescer, eu vou ser diferente. Eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, representa a Valtune, represento Carolina, represento Nandara. E Chica da Silva, sou mulher, sou negra. Meu cabelo é duro, forte, autoritário, às vezes frágil, eu assumo. Mulher oprimida, sem voz obediente. Quando eu crescer, eu vou ser diferente. Eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, represento a Qualtune, represento Carolina, represento Dandara. E Chica da Silva, sou mulher, sou negra. Meu cabelo é duro, forte, autoritário, às vezes frágil, eu assumo. Oi, eu essa porra, eu não vou lavar a louça. Não aceito opressão. Abaixa sua voz, abaixa sua mão. Gente, eu nunca esqueci essa música, gente. Desculpa.
I've been singing that song for 3 years, and I've never forgotten the lyrics till now.
So we still have some times for questions. I'm opening up for the audience because I think you're eager. So everyone, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. I think the music really changed the mood. It's wonderful. Carol, thank you so much. Thank you for your art. Thank you for your music. Thank you for your story, for being here and sharing it with us. And I think that's it. We need to have all voices in this space and spaces in Brazil, because that's the only way we'll change. You've had more than 3,000 votes in the election. That's 3,000 people who trust you, that you could do it differently, being elected. So that's extremely important. And I think that it needs to be amplified, and it needs to grow more and more. I think that art itself, the images that Éder brought us are very impactful, really moved us. And it's different when we see a picture in the newspaper and when you see it transformed into art, so it gives another perspective. But I'm going to talk too much. What I wanted to comment and bring as a question to all of you, and Sidney spoke about us, should we accept people who want to spew hate, to talk about destruction and homophobic speeches and racist speeches in this culture spaces, the academic spaces, the scientific spaces. And I think I want to congratulate a great portion of the Defend Democracy in Brazil in New York and the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, who managed to pressure the Natural History Museum into canceling an event with Bolsonaro. Of course, that the institution that wants to honor him still trying to find an venue. But what we wanted to say is that no, the museum, the Natural History Museum, is not a space for a person who doesn't support culture, science, diversity, who's not there. So I don't think we can silence ourselves beyond that. And we understood that as a victory. And we were like, oh my God, we did it. So I wanted you to comment a little bit about that movement. Because sometimes when we're here, what we can do is that from the visual perspective. And I've seen a lot of news in Brazil, and I don't know if this is being impactful there. How are you seeing this movement here, especially so we can direct our actions here? How can we give support to you? Thank you. We're doing questions 3 by 3, I think, for those of you who are listening to our translations. Thank you so much for your testimony. Carol, you're a force of nature. And I would do a whole conference only on what you said. I want to thank you for accepting this invitation, for sharing the space, for occupying the space with your presence. You carry this story. Congratulations, thank you. You're incredible. And I couldn't help but making a comparison about your story about how funk saved your life and the rap MC Marcinho. This idea that like he was a funk singer, but he was a father. And I think it's wonderful that you are not apologetic about being a funk singer, and that's wonderful. Éder, your work is amazing. First, the color perspective. Actually, the pages, the police pages, had never had colorful pictures. Unlike the social columns, that was always colorful. That was not an accident. That was a symbolic representation of richness versus poverty. So for you to give back color to that is very impactful. I didn't know in the scale. I didn't know in the scale that your work is just amazing. I don't know if you know the work of a street artist, a Spanish street artist, Lita Cabello, who works with scales that are just you, and you really reminded me of her, this neo-figurativism and neo-realism that was impressive. But my question goes to Sidney. Sidney, you made an interesting question, but when does the reality mystification and when does it come from, when it comes from people who should be defending academic freedom? For instance, Camille Paglia just gave a talk defending people who speak about gender ideology. So as a professor in an American university, Camille Paglia is defending the idea that gender studies in schools are an ideology. So how do we deal with it when our peers who should be defending academic freedom are not doing it? Well, thank you for this panel. It was really inspirational and shows us the concrete possibilities of dialogue between worlds that are not in the same space, but that should be dialoguing. Keeping a little bit on what Jean was saying, I wanted to ask something from Sidney. My name is Michelle German from the Federal University of Rio. I don't know how many of you here are professors of Brazilian universities right now. Could you raise your hands? Our experience right now is very complex. Even though academic freedom is still guaranteed by law, and at this we're still not threatened, there is the presence of a term. This term may be exaggerated, but it's reasonable, which is the government militias who come into the classrooms in order to try to control the classes given their professors. Which completely dictates academic freedom, and that's their win, because professors decide to change their classes in order to maintain an institutional peace. And my question is how to deal with this new environment. An environment where to fight for academic freedom is not just fight for legality, but also institutional culture that allows professors to teach, despite the numerous presence of militias that avoid this freedom from actually happening. I think we can start answering, and then if we have more time, we'll go back and we'll do another round.
I don't want to start because I'm. But here we go. Everything's new. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows the answer. If anybody knows, you're welcome to answer for me. But I think this idea of the repercussions of, I mean, of course, I've been following what's happening in Brazil and the list that the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil has published in terms of the presence of Bolsonaro in university, in the New York Met event. But in the case of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, our main goal is to work on the North American public opinion and try and sway that to put Brazil on the radar, because we know that we have a government that is capable of unimaginable violence. We know that the government is capable of doing these things. They're happening, and they will continue to happen. And also, keeping Brazil on the radar in this way, then hopefully we'll be able to help fight what's going on. Publishing books against the Brazilian dictatorship, was a thing back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and these kinds of resistance can have the potential to kind of put things on their head. So, I mean, let's suppose that there's a democratic gain or liberal gain. This is a way of keeping Brazil on the radar and maybe exerting pressure on the Brazilian government that will result in positive change. And so I'm not sure exactly. I think it's very hard for us to imagine what we do here and think of what its repercussions are in Brazil. The movement is happening in Brazil, and I think it would be too presumptuous of us to think that we can have a decisive influence on what's happening there. But we have to focus on the reality here, which is that Bolsonaro is important, and we need to talk about him, and we need to raise awareness of what he's capable of. And so, in that sense, he ends up giving us importance. But the situation in Brazil is another story. So, Jean, I'm not sure exactly what to say. I was sincere. I don't know the answer to any of the questions that you asked me. I wasn't aware of this issue, and I understand that these battles are specific. I'm concerned with the moment in which we disregard all the advice that's given us, and we have people who are criminals who are kind of twisted, and that they have positions of power and they have political cachet in our society, and so the fight to keep Bolsonaro from coming to New York and being honored and these kinds of things, inviting people to various institutions to kind of perpetuate discourses of hate are issues that are very real, and
you know, people have the right to speak in a hateful way where they are, but we're in a situation in which we used to be in a situation in which only what the white men said was authoritative and only what they said was the rule. But and this is being disrupted a little bit. So people are given a little bit more power and being able to disrupt that discourse a little bit. I'm not sure exactly. It's a difficult discussion to have because administrators at university, talk about freedom of expression and all these things, and they say no, people can come here and they can draw swastikas and they can say whatever they want, but it's a complicated issue. So this question about the militia, are they students or are they people that come into the classroom and
As a rule, they're not students. They are people who come in and who utilize of the academic dynamic to start the hostility. But lately, the students who are drawn into these militias have risen.
No, I wasn't aware that any of that was happening. I've never experienced that personally, and any type of restriction. I don't know. It seems like a new thing. I'm not exactly sure how to react to it. I know that in the case of the institute the institution where I taught, there are two things that are a little bit contradictory, but that are being carried out at the same time. The director, for example, says that he opens with he works with his door open, which I never did. He has an open door policy, so it's open to anyone. Anyone could come there and do anything they wanted to in terms of violence. But there's also this notion that the more open we are, the strange things will be visible, and the better equipped we'll be to kind of denounce what's going on. And when somebody walks in with a rifle or a machine gun, I don't know exactly how that works. But this question of intimidation in the classroom, I'm not exactly sure how it works, and I was never, I never controlled who came in and who left my classes. People could come in and leave as they pleased. But because the open door policy is part and parcel of the university environment, so But I would ask, what are you doing? So we're trying to figure out how to respond to these threats, and we're kind of disputing the legality. That's why I think the legal question is one thing, that we legally have the right to teach whatever we want, sure, but in practice, do we actually have the environment in which we can teach without being intimidated or threatened? But I don't know. They're coming to my classes. I think this process starts in the secondary education and then goes to higher education. It's a big project by the government, I think, to.
So it looks like in the university, particularly, there's a bigger debate, and Deborah actually did a video saying, yes, I will debate Olavo de Carvalho, but in the method, the academic method. So there's something to us in the university and in the humanities. The humanities is a little bit more complicated for the idea of method. But it seems to me like we're living a moment in a history in social science about debating the method. It seems a little odd to think about this because we end up in a positivist debate. But with talking about data, Olavo de Carvalho cannot sustain what he says in a debate where method is taken seriously. And I think that's a challenge for us in the humanities. Can we give a little bit of space for the other panel members to answer as well? I actually am thinking this debate is great. But an interesting question, answering for your question. Yesterday I was talking to my boyfriend. He was saying, well, how are things going on there? Because sometimes the academic world is very distant. Since you're in the United States, it's also very distant what you're doing here. I only knew about the museum conflict with the honoring Bolsonaro because the girls told me it was an articulation that started the groups here that are organized in Brown and other universities. Because when it comes to us, it usually comes through the small news, and in Global it said, for instance, that kept showing the tweets from the museum, that first it was analyzed the situation, thinking about it, and later on that it wouldn't happen. They justified that they didn't know who the person who'd be honored was. And I worked with public relations for a lot of time, and we know that the releases are sent, but it's the info that they show us is very selective. So it's a little bit sad because I didn't know that there was an articulation group that is in this, that engaged here. But it's something that Sidney said. Each of us in this space does it a little bit, do what they can. So the way you can work is this. But then I keep thinking, what can we do there? How can a professor of the Federal University of Rio work and articulate if he's dealing with militias in his class? So I think in Brazil we're thinking, oh my God, what can we do? Because we're thrown in a corner. We're backed into a corner. So listening to the testimonies of Jean and Marcia yesterday, you feel yourself you're at a spot where you think you have to do something. You can't not do anything. But at the same time, that threatens your life. And I say that to Carol a lot because she's a person who something can happen to her all the time. So when it becomes a threat to your life, and I said that to her when she said she was going to go into politics, and I introduced her to Marielle, and we went to her house and all of that, and Marielle was thinking that I was going to go in with Carol, that I was be her chief of staff. And I told her my dad worked 28 years with politics. There's no possibility. I don't have the stomach for it. That's the expression I use. People who work with politics today, who take it seriously, have a stomach that I do not have, the guts. So I think that people like Marielle, Taliria, Mônica, Francisco, Ara Carolina, they're extremely necessary. But me, Ana Paula, I made a choice as a woman, as a Black woman, that my priority today is another one, because I need to take care of myself. So I've seen a lot of my friends putting other priorities ahead of it and happening what happened to them. So it's a crossroad, is a moment where you have to choose. I'm going to make it happen, but to what extent are we allowed to actually work politically without it being violent to me, without me getting hurt, without it threatening my life? Because today as a Black woman, really, what I want to be is happy. Like, have the things that most of Black people can't have. Of course, my work with Carol is very politicized. We wanna bring things to the people, but there's also a little bit of that selfishness. I also need to think about myself, and it's what I think with Jean when Jean steps down. because if I'm dead, it's not gonna matter. So I have to leave. I'm gonna suffer. It's not easy at all. I'm not in his shoes, so I can't speak for experience. I don't know where he's living. But there's a moment where you gotta make choices. I can't stop thinking about whether or not whether had Marielle known this was gonna happen, whether or not she was gonna stay or she was gonna quit. She was. I wonder if she kept going if she knew she was gonna be killed, because we don't know. We don't know. People who are stepping up, they don't know. That's because we sometimes don't take seriously threats. Carol, sometimes on Instagram, on Facebook, she will laugh. She will send it to me. Before she would laugh a little bit. Today, I know she's afraid. It's a fear she didn't have. Before, she thought it was like a joke. You know, I would be scared. I would be scared out of my mind, and she'd be like, "Oh, Anna, it's fine." But after you were stopped by the police, how she was, after there's an attempt of feminicide against her. There was even a more recent police encounter where they said that they actually treated her well, but actually were very violent. So I think that we need to be alert at all times about what we need to do. But in Brazil, there's this difference. To what extent can we go when we're in Brazil? Because things are crazy, literally. I also cannot answer these questions like all of this panel, but I wanted to comment on this victory from the movement here about the canceling of the event in the museum, the importance of it being a victory, because I think the militancy in Brazil has been very defeated. The Ele Não, the Not Him movement, the movement against the World Cup, against the coup, they're all lost, right? They're all lost. And that you won something here is really important. It's really important because it reverberates there. And people share the news. In Europe, when somebody rejects Bolsonaro, it's very important. They're all victories. And for us who have a lot of defeats, consecutive defeats, it's very hard. And so this helps us to think and ground our fight. I think we can take one or two questions. We have two more questions. My name is Tasha Toya. I'm a historian. I'm a student doing my doctorate in Georgetown. I live here, and I'm really happy about this victory. And I shared it a lot. I shared a petition and all that. My question is for Carol. It's something more focused, because in the presentation that Leila talked about too, she said you were in the elections by PCdoB. I wanted to know about this decision because you're very close to Marielle and Taliria, and I wanted to know why you chose PCdoB, which is the Communist Party, rather than the party of her friends that was the Social and Liberty Party. So I was going to go through the Social and Liberty Party, and I had a very honest conversation with Marcelo Freixo, where he told me where my life was going to change, and I would have to go through securities, and my life would change completely. And he said, we lost Marielle, and you are in the same things. So I was in a very crazy time in my life, and my ex-husband, we separated. Like it was I just wanted to separate, and he jumped an electric fence and came into my house at 4 a.m. with a knife, and I fought with him. The only reasons I'm alive are God and my physicality. And I locked myself in the bathroom, and I was lucky that somebody else was in the house and managed to leave and call the police. And so the judge accepted his version. My witness was afraid of dying. I had a security system, a video security system, and the guy deleted the images. He only left the images where the police comes in and takes him away. The more important ones he erased. So I was desperate. I was in my street asking for all my neighbors for the image, for the video proof. And none of my neighbors would give me the footage. And my ex was released. He was arrested for 6 months. He was in prison he was trying to kill me, and his sentence was 11 months in semi-open regime where he only has to sleep in prison. So I was thinking, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I thought about going into politics, and I decided to go into politics and save other women. And Marcelo Freixo came in and said that my life would have to change. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go someplace else. And PCdoB was also a left party and defends the same things. And I went through PCdoB. If PCdoB didn't accept me, I would go to another one on the left, because I was like, in this moment, I was very desperate to be in politics. And I always say in every interview that it was the worst thing I've ever done. My family called me and they said, look, you're gonna be killed. And I said that I was gonna be killed anyway. And I was killed in a way. And I managed to survive, and I was born again that day. And I could be dead right now, and I survived, and I have to do something. That's what I said to them. And so I didn't want to give up. I was afraid. The police stopped me and threw me in the ground, and that had never happened before. I've been singing funk for 8 years, and that never happened. And that was how I was. I was saying, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And just talking about what Anna was saying, I wonder if Marielle had known, would she have kept doing it? And I think she would. I think she would, because she was so strong. She was so strong, and I gained this kind of strength after this happened to me. I was attacked in every single way. My grandmother called me. She's 81. She's not in social media. But neighbors started telling her, Dona Lita, what is happening with Carolina? She was such a nice kid. And my grandma was, what do you mean what's happening with Carolina? Oh, because there's a photo of her with a rifle. And they took a picture from one of my videos, my music videos, with a paintball gun. And they took my subtitle of the picture out and just threw it in WhatsApp groups for policemen in Niterói. So I was stuck home. I couldn't go out, and I was already in sort of this domestic arrest, already living in fear because my ex-husband was out, and I had to live in even more fear like this, and I didn't want to give up, but I prayed I wouldn't win. I didn't want to give up publicly. I didn't want to say, I didn't want to step down, but at that point, I couldn't handle it, so that's the worst thing I've ever done. Uma última pergunta. Carol, I wanted to ask you the interference of evangelical churches on funk. I wanted to know your opinion about this. I'm a professor in Brazil. I'm on vacation here. and I teach anthropology to musicians. And I noticed how there's a rise of evangelical students. And I have a prejudice against evangelical churches. I'm learning how to deal with this. And I have students who are there, so I have to dialogue with them. But I wanted to hear from you if there's any interference from the evangelical churches. How does that work for you? What has been your experience? It's my assumption that is a strong presence in the community. So what's your relationship with that? So I have not a lot of understanding about religion. I believe in all of them. But once in a while, I'll stop in the front of an evangelical church and I'll chat with the minister once in a while when I'm lost in the street, need directions. And once in a while, I'll help them out. I believe a lot in God. People think it's weird. Funk singer believing in God, they don't think those things match because I'll sing very crass things, but I believe in God, and I think God is always present in our lives. Right now, nowadays, I will perform in clubs and very structured places, with contracts, with chocolate milk, candy, cheese, but up until 2015, I'd only perform in baile funks, which are funk parties inside the communities, dangerous places. And seriously, very honestly, I would cry. Thursdays would come and I would cry because if my grandpa was alive, he wouldn't approve of what I was doing. My grandma wasn't approving. So I'd leave home on Fridays, not knowing if I'd come back. Sometimes I put my hands on the microphones and shootings would start. And many different situations happen. So I'd always pray, asking God to protect me, to not let the bullets hit me. And I was never shot. Everything worked out. I was very humiliated by my team, 4 men, and all of them over 30. And I was 16. So those guys, they would hear everything before they heard me, and they were absolutely sexist and misogynistic. Like, they would do drugs inside the car next to me. They would pick up women and just leave me alone, and I'd get lost. But there was this mood of, Carolina, go, keep going, because one day you're going to have your own team. Your work is going to be organized, going to be structured. And you won't have to subject yourself to types of things. And I really believe that voice was God. But till this day, I'm 25, I'm going to be 26. I do not know what religion God is in. Because it's crazy. People from the evangelic church or say, "Oh my God, you're gonna sing for God," and people don't believe that the God was with me coming into the favela, even though I sang very crass things, God was protecting me. But I believe it. So I don't have a lot of understanding about religion. I think it's wild. That's that. Just to piggyback. The next piano is about religion. Just to piggyback from that, beyond working with Carol, I work with a rap group called, it's a trio. It's a trio of rap women in Vidigal. Now it's a duo. One of them has left recently. And I understood what you said about the church, because especially for artists that are in peripheries, and for youth in general, it's very hard to be youth there, too young there. You don't have a lot of options. So I see the evangelical church like the traffic, like drug trafficking is one of those. I don't have an option, and drug trafficking is a way to be successful and get money and buy the things you want, which is one way to attract the youth, and the other ones are attracted by the salvation of the evangelical church. And for me, that's a lack of available psychologists and therapists for youth in the community, because nowadays they find a false psychological support in the church. Because the other day somebody said, "Oh, I had a problem with the contract," and they took the contract to the church and it was blessed and everything was right. But no, you need a lawyer. You need a lawyer to figure it out. Nowadays, I'm a member of Afro-Brazilian church, of the Afro-Brazilian faith, and I believe that there's a greater faith. But my problem with evangelical churches is there's a brainwashing, and because the state does not give youth in the peripheries, even psychological therapy, education. Like Carol said that she was in sports when she was younger. They end up in the church, in the evangelical church, and that's what that space becomes. And it's contradictory because everything is evangelical. Then the songs have to be about the church. Everything has to be about the church, and if it doesn't have to be about the church, then it's wrong. And I think that's a problem, because my grandma is evangelical, my family is evangelical, and I don't see anything wrong with any religion. I just think they need to know that they have many options for other things, that if they sing funk, they'll still be loved by God, and if they're gay, they'll still be loved by God, and if they have other life choices that are not exactly what the church is saying, then God still loves them. And I think that's the problem with the church, with its youth.